Hello everyone, my name is Benjamin Yoder with One Controller Port, here today talking about Ridge Racer DS. This is an enhanced DS port of an enhanced Nintendo 64 port of the original Ridge Racer for the PlayStation 1 and arcade. I have not played either the original games or the Nintendo 64 port, but it sounds like basically the 64 release added some new tracks, where the DS version adds local wireless multiplayer and touchscreen-based steering controls. It's worth noting before we get started, I'm not really familiar with other Ridge Racer games, so I won't really be comparing it to other releases in the series, and I'm also running this unofficially on a Wii U, though I didn't notice any issues when playing it this way. If you're not familiar with the Ridge Racer series, this is a driving game with the core component of it really being based around drifting, and how this drifting works sounds like it varies per game. In this game specifically, it feels kind of oddly magnetic. You kind of snap to the middle of the course when you start a drift, and it's like really slippery, so much so that you can do a complete 360 in your car while maintaining forward momentum. And as somebody who plays mostly kart racers, this feels fairly unique compared to most other driving games I've played. Unfortunately, the game doesn't really teach you how to do this. There's no real in-game tutorial, so I had to read the manual on how drifting works, and it basically comes down to like letting go of the gas on a turn and then reinitiating the gas, and that will put you into a drift, or tapping on the brakes. Part of the reason why it's important to have a drift in this game is the lack of an analog stick. It's really hard to navigate tight corners, and drifting basically acts as an autopilot around these turns. And when you're successfully executing these drifts, it's a really exciting feeling with like almost like an adrenaline rush as you edge around these corners, because the car just basically sticks to a single path on the track as you're going at full speed when you're doing it successfully. I was never able to really master the drifting in this game, even after playing through basically 99% of its content. It's easy enough to initiate a drift, but what was challenging was figuring out how to get out of a drift. I believe the idea is you're supposed to straighten out after you're drifting, but I was never able to get this to work consistently when using the D-pad, which resulted in a lot of times where I'd end up just kind of stuck drifting, so I'd lose a lot of speed, or I would unexpectedly straighten out when I wasn't expecting to, and I would just kind of launch directly into the wall. So I just never really got a full feeling of how the drifting in this game should work. And it doesn't help that the D-pad in this game is just really touchy in general. Admittedly, this is an issue with a lot of D-pad based racers, but as the car's steering gets better, it becomes so hard to judge how to nudge your car to make small corrections, which honestly leads into times where if you just so much double tap the D-pad, you'll just go launching straight into the wall. And maybe being able to more reliably drift would resolve this issue if this is something that you're able to kind of nail down how to get out of a drift reliably. But when parts of the drift are kind of a liability, there's definitely a temptation to just kind of navigate parts of the course just using the traditional steering in this game. Now there is stylus-based steering control in this game, so you can get a more precise analog control of your car. And there's also actually a thumb strap mode in this game too, so you can use the Nintendo DS thumb strap if you remember what that was. Unfortunately, I do not have my thumb strap to test, but I did test stylus controls, and unfortunately there's just no physical feedback on the wheel. I mean, that's not really the fault of the game. The DS doesn't really have any kind of force feedback to touch, but it does kind of expect you to kind of follow the arc of the wheel. So you're kind of supposed to do this kind of rainbow motion to turn the car, and I just didn't feel like this felt natural. It's not like a Wii wheel on the Nintendo Wii where turning the steering wheel just felt as natural as driving a car. In this game, moving the stylus in that kind of archway just didn't really feel right. On the original DS, this isn't too bad because there are kind of the barricades at the side of the screen to kind of prevent you from overshooting, where you should be going with the stylus in terms of making those turns. But if you're playing this on a Wii U, where you're using a gamepad, or if you're playing this on a Nintendo 3DS at the game's original resolution, where there's basically dead space around the game within the touchscreen itself, it's really easy to go just too far out on the screen and just basically lose all control as your stylus goes off the actual play space. So if you're going to use stylus control, definitely stick with an original Nintendo DS or play the game using the upscaled resolution on a Nintendo 3DS as well. But again, I just don't really feel like this is a natural way to play the game. I think something where you just kind of slid the stylus left and right probably would have been better than something where you had to kind of like arc the steering wheel. It's not just a control issue with this game though. There are some problems with like the balance and some of the technical design. For example, the NPC difficulty seems to vary wildly. There's sometimes where I do a lap and I do basically a perfect lap and I still couldn't catch up to the person in front of me, but other times where I had a poor lap and then the car in front of me just seemed to be magically slower and I could get right past them. I did a couple tests with this, and it really seems like the game just kind of randomly decides the speed value of the other cars, and it's kind of frustrating where even if you have that perfect lap, you just can't catch up to the AI in some cases. Maybe you could say this is somewhat realistic, obviously based off how another player might be racing. You having a perfect run might not even lead to you getting ahead of them, but in some cases I used actual save states to kind of test how this worked, and it seems like that it's just kind of random whether or not the CPUs are catch-upable or not. Another challenge this game has is colliding with other cars, and I think that's a part of the challenge of this game. You want to make sure you're not bumping into other cars and things like that. But the collision in this game is really strange. It's almost like the collision of the cars in front of it at times. So what happens sometimes is you'll kind of be in front of a car or somebody will be coming up behind you, and they will bump behind you, but the game treats it like you are behind them and will essentially act as if you rear-ended them and shoot you backwards. So sometimes when you're driving, you'll just randomly shoot backwards, even if you just pass in front of them, or if they came up behind you at an angle. It's like that collision just kind of overlaps with you and launches you backwards for some reason. It almost feels like you're playing like a laggy online racer at times, even though you're playing this like locally and against computer players. Now there are 9 courses initially, as well as 3 different tracks that these courses are laid out across. And then eventually, after you beat those, you have to get first place in each one. You get a reverse mode that's added as well, where you race on these tracks backwards. But the CPUs get significantly faster, and you have to kind of unlock cars through this car attack mode, where you kind of duel other cars. And once you get their car, you get the car with increased stats. And this game gets incredibly fast and incredibly challenging. It's really impressive, actually, how much this game keeps up with the speed. There's like no frame rate drop whatsoever when you're racing. But it does get really hard. There's also some final bonus tracks too, but they were just like so challenging that I had to save state through them to see the rest of the game. And I think, normally I wouldn't do something like that, but just the combination of like the weird collision, unpredictable AI difficulty, the D-pad sensitivity, and the drifting just not really being communicated very well to the player of how it should work, ultimately results in the game becoming pretty frustrating to play, and as the game gets more challenging, these issues just become even more apparent as you kind of struggle with the game's controls as you need to like race in those perfect runs essentially. I honestly got so frustrated at times that weirdly enough I found the announcer's jabs in this game at the player a bit annoying. That's never happened to me in a game like this before, so it's just like it was just this weird experience of just like being very angry at this disembodied voice at taunting me while driving. So at the very least, the announcer did his job of getting me all riled up, although maybe for the wrong reasons. As somebody who's never played Ridge Racer, I think this game initially is a really fun experience, and as a launch title, it seems pretty reasonable. I have not played Asphalt, which also came out at launch as well as a racing game, and I'm sure there's other Nintendo DS more realistic racers as well that I'm just not familiar with, but it just seems like a really solid racing game, and at the time with 4-player local wireless, that would have been a cool multiplayer experience on a system that, was an early instance of having wireless connectivity built into the console. Now, keep in mind that's local wireless, not online play. But I get the feeling that there are better Ridge Racers to play. Again, I can't say for sure as I've never played another, but there's just a lot of issues with this game, and a lot of them feel more like technical issues or the how the Nintendo DS handles its controls that feel like the more challenging parts of this game. But if you do play it, I think it's fun enough. Just maybe don't commit to getting through the entire game. Anyways, that's it for this week. Thanks for coming. OneControlPort.com's the website. We kind of focus on games that kind of have a unique place in history or have a unique take on like a genre or a franchise. Maybe Ridge Racer DS is maybe not one of those games, but I played it and here I am. I made a review of it. If you want to see more racing game reviews though, I have a review of Jeep Thrills on Nintendo Wii, a semi-realistic kind of Jeep racing game. It's actually Jeep branded. You can check that out. And then I also, if you want something that's a bit more interesting or unique, I'd recommend checking out my quick play of Pen Triathlon, which is a penguin racing game that you go through like swimming through water and like slide on your belly and run and stuff. It's a really cool game, so I recommend checking that out as well. Anyways, thank you so much for your time today. OneControllerPort.com is the website, and I hope you have a great week. Bye!